Hi guys. So what I want to talk to you about is what's called a hub and spoke pattern in freight. Most transport companies in Australia operate under the guidance of a hub and spoke arrangement. Some of you may know what that means, some of you might be a new term, but think of a wheel, big circular, think of the axle right in the middle and the spokes that go out. Well, keeping that in mind, that's what we want to explain today and how it all works, how it operates. One thing people and customers in my experience don't really understand is how freight actually moves and how it travels from place to place, from destination to destination. I don't think there's probably a couple, but I don't think there's many people out there that think the same truck that picks freight up is the same truck that delivers it, especially when it's in a different state or in a different location or significant distance. But what they really don't get is just how it operates, how many people potentially touch the items, how it works, how it moves. So today I'm going to talk you through a little bit about just the truck movements, maybe not the number of hands that things go through, but the amount of truck movements that goods might undertake. Now, on the board, you'll see my wonderful drawing of the east coast of Australia, where I've highlighted two locations, Sydney and Melbourne. So this is probably the most heavily travelled freight route in Australia for various different reasons we'll cover off later on. But understanding how it all works under this hub and spoke model is probably the real key here. So if we take these two main areas, being Sydney and Melbourne, how do we get freight backwards and forwards? Well, some of you this might be new, some of you might be a bit older, but we run big trucks that run from our depot in Melbourne all the way through to our depot in Sydney and vice versa. This is what we call a line haul component. Line LH, line haul. In looking at the line haul side of it, it's very easy. It's a big semi-trailer or B-double, which we'll cover off later on. We'll go from Melbourne into Sydney and Sydney into Melbourne. That'll generally happen overnight. But obviously, it's not the same driver in the same truck that delivers that freight out to the end customer, unless it's something special. But for the sake of our conversation today, it's not the same vehicle. Now, each of these areas and each of these locations are broken down into individual zones. So whether it's the northwest, southwest, east, city, central, some areas are a little bit bigger than others, some are a little bit smaller. It really you break it down and it depends on how big they are. And we can say the same thing in the different areas here as well. Now, you might be aware that these particular items will go on those different size vehicles out to that end user. So they've got to be loaded in the depot. So in the mornings, a driver comes in, loads all his freight up, and then goes out to do his run. And that happens across all the different locations and different routes there. Same thing in Sydney. So out of the depot here in Sydney to all these different locations each morning. Now, the driver's truck's full, takes all his freight out. He's obviously got some room to be able to bring the freight back. So what will happen is he then reverses that process and all the freight comes back into the depot at the end of the night. Once all that freight's back, they get it all together, the guys out the back, they load it all up, they sort it out, they split it up, and then they load it into the big trucks. And that's where they will travel up to Sydney or down to Melbourne. Now, just to throw another spanner in the works, sometimes what they do is they stop halfway. Now, just as a little bit of bonus information, there's a point halfway between Sydney and Melbourne that's called Tarcutta or Holbrook, depending on where you're actually coming from. Your depot's located in those places. The truck will actually arrive into here, and they will literally take the trailers off the prime mover, swap over, put the trailers from this truck on and drive back. Now that's called a changeover. Most of the time that'll happen when you've got company drivers that you don't want to send them to stay somewhere overnight. So the guy from Melbourne will come in at 8:30 at night, pick up his truck, drive up, stop halfway, drive back, so he's actually at home. So a lot of big companies, major companies will work that way. Some of the small ones do too. It really breaks down to volume and how it all works. But that's just a little bit of a side note. That's how freight gets delivered. So just to recap that, if we've got something, and I'll make this a little bit neater for us so we can have a look. So we've got our major depot here in the middle, or wherever it is. It might not be the geographical middle, but for the sake of this purpose, it's in the middle. The freight comes in there overnight. It then gets split up and sent out to its individual delivery zone into the different locations. Now, here at Hunter Express in Sydney, we've got approximately 40 of these locations and these runs, or these areas we like to call them, for the drivers. There's about 40, and there's about the same in Melbourne too. Now, by cleaning this up, if I do a couple more links, that is where the idea of a hub and spoke model comes from. Now, most of the competitors that you will be out there pitching against or coming up against will handle freight the same way. So this freight comes in, gets split up and sent out. Now, what I want you to do is just have a think about how many movements that vehicle has. So if we take something from a metro location in Melbourne, let's say Dandenong, which is where our depot is. So if that freight gets picked up, it's on a vehicle. So that's one vehicle that gets it back to the depot. Then it goes on to this vehicle to come up to Sydney. So that's the second vehicle. And then it goes out to this vehicle, out to, let's call it North Sydney. So it's coming out to North Sydney here. So then it's on a third truck. This is why it's so important we talk to customers about how they package their goods, about giving us the right information so we can plan all this out. But you can see how that one movement there, which is quite simple, going from a metro location in Melbourne to a metro location in Sydney, can actually have a few more hands and a few more people involved. Now, once we go through looking through the depot and going through that, you'll have a real understanding of how many pairs of hands that touches, or how many times the freight actually gets moved. But in terms of vehicles, you're looking at an absolute minimum of 3 different trucks and 3 different vehicles this piece of freight's going to be on. So that's why it comes down to that information point. That's the idea behind a hub and spoke model. It's not too flashy, it's not too fancy, but if you imagine the bike tire with the spokes coming in, it's very similar. Some spokes are just a bit longer than others, as in the distance away from your primary depot, but the idea, that's how it supports the main structure.